A few weeks before our 25th wedding anniversary, Brooke and I were sitting on the front porch of our house in Franklin, Tennessee. The late afternoon sun was settling behind the trees, and the air carried that familiar warmth that comes before autumn finally arrives. We had pulled out a stack of old photo albums, laughing at hairstyles, faded clothes, and memories that seemed too distant to belong to us anymore. Brooke stopped at a picture from our first summer together. I was 19, standing beside my old pickup truck with my arm around her shoulders. She smiled, traced the edge of the photograph with her finger, and said softly, "I'm glad you forgave me for that one kiss." I chuckled without looking up. That was a long time ago. For 25 years, that had been the entire story. Before we got engaged, she'd admitted she'd kissed her ex-boyfriend, Tyler, once while we were dating. She cried. I forgave her, and I never mentioned it again. It became one of those things young couples survive before building a life together. When I finally looked at her, she wasn't smiling anymore. She held the photograph in both hands and stared at it, as though she were seeing someone else's life. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "It wasn't just one kiss." Everything around me became strangely quiet. The cicadas were still singing. Cars still rolled past our street. Somewhere down the block a dog barked. But inside me, 25 years of certainty came to a complete stop. We had known each other since high school, though we hadn't started dating until after graduation. Back then, Franklin still felt like a small town where everyone seemed connected by someone else. Brooke was funny, confident, and impossible to ignore. I was quieter, more comfortable fixing old guitars than making conversation. Somehow we worked. We married young, moved to Knoxville, and spent the next 25 years building a life that always seemed stronger than either of us expected. Together, we opened a small business restoring vintage musical instruments. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. Musicians from all over Tennessee trusted us with family heirlooms and forgotten treasures. Brooke handled customers and paperwork while I spent long days bringing old Martins, Gibsons, and Fenders back to life. We raised 2 children between repair benches, school events, mortgage payments, and ordinary evenings that felt so dependable I never questioned them. Our marriage wasn't perfect. We argued about money when business was slow, disagreed over parenting more than once, and occasionally spent a night sleeping on opposite sides of the bed. But none of that ever made me doubt her loyalty. The only shadow from the beginning of our relationship had been that single kiss with Tyler. She confessed before we got engaged, saying it happened once, that she regretted it immediately, and that she chose me. I believed every word because I wanted our marriage to begin with forgiveness instead of suspicion. Now, after hearing those 5 quiet words on the porch, memories I hadn't thought about in decades started drifting back. Nights when Brooke suddenly couldn't meet me because of family plans. Times she canceled dates at the last minute. Moments that had seemed ordinary then, but no longer fit the story I had trusted for half my life. That evening we stayed on the porch until the sun disappeared, but neither of us touched the photo albums again. Brooke spoke quietly, as though lowering her voice could soften what she was about to say. She admitted that during the first few weeks of our relationship, she hadn't been choosing between Tyler and me after all. She had been seeing both of us. While I believed we were building something new, she had been meeting him almost every night after telling me she was with friends, helping her mother, or studying late. She insisted it wasn't the story I was imagining. She said they had never had intercourse, that the relationship had been emotional, physical, confusing, and fueled by her inability to let go of someone she had dated for years. She repeated that she chose me in the end and never looked back. She kept saying those last 4 words as if they erased everything that came before them. I didn't interrupt. I didn't accuse her of lying, even though I suddenly realized she had been lying for 25 years. I simply listened. Every sentence she spoke replaced another memory I had carried since I was 19. Our first dates. Our first "I love you." The nights I waited for her phone call. None of them belonged to the version of our relationship I had believed. When she finally stopped talking, she searched my face for anger, disbelief, anything at all. I couldn't give her what she expected because I wasn't angry yet. I was trying to understand how an entire chapter of my life could change in a single conversation. The past hadn't moved, but somehow it no longer looked like my past. It looked like someone else's story that I had been living without ever knowing it. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because I hadn't really slept at all. Brooke was still beside me, breathing peacefully, while I lay staring at the ceiling. For her, whatever had happened belonged to another lifetime. She had carried it for 25 years, slowly turning it into a memory. For me, it had happened less than 12 hours earlier. My mind wasn't replaying old events. It was discovering them for the first time. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. When I got out of bed, I made coffee the same way I always did. I fed the dog, unlocked the workshop, and answered 2 customer emails before Brooke came downstairs. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I realized I wasn't waiting for another apology or a better explanation. Neither could return the years I had spent believing a story that wasn't true. The man who had proposed to Brooke, married her, bought a house with her, and started a family had made those choices without knowing the complete picture. That thought stayed with me throughout the day. People often say time heals betrayal, but I no longer believe that. Time had only hidden it. The calendar didn't make her deception smaller. It only made it older. She had lived with the truth long enough for it to lose its weight. I had inherited it all at once. Something inside me shifted before evening arrived. I stopped trying to squeeze this new reality back into the marriage I remembered. I accepted that the beginning of our story had never been what I thought it was. I couldn't change those early weeks, but I could stop pretending they belonged to the version of our lives I had carried for 25 years. That quiet decision changed the way I looked at everything afterward. Over the next few weeks, I stopped searching for explanations and started paying attention instead. Every evening after work, I found myself opening boxes that had been sitting untouched in the attic for years. They held old photographs, birthday cards, ticket stubs, faded postcards, and little keepsakes that had survived every move we ever made. I wasn't looking for proof anymore. I was trying to understand whether the story I remembered had ever truly existed. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I opened a small cedar box that Brooke had packed before we left Knoxville. Beneath a stack of greeting cards was a folded envelope with Tyler's name written across the front in handwriting I immediately recognized. The letter had been mailed only a month before our wedding. I read it once, then again. There was nothing explicit inside, but the familiarity between them was impossible to ignore. He wrote about memories they shared, about unfinished conversations, and hoped she had found what she was looking for. Brooke insisted she had forgotten the letter even existed. I didn't argue. I simply placed it back inside the envelope and continued searching. Something had changed in the way I listened to her. Every time we talked about those first weeks of our relationship, small details shifted. One meeting became 2. A phone call became several. A timeline stretched or shrank depending on the question. None of the changes were dramatic by themselves, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer dismiss. I stopped correcting her or pointing out the contradictions. I only listened, remembered, and quietly compared each new version to the last. For the first time in our marriage, silence seemed more revealing than any answer she could have given. The situation stopped belonging only to Brooke and me the day Tyler called. I almost ignored the unfamiliar number, but something told me to answer. His voice sounded older than I remembered, slower, almost cautious. He said he'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that Brooke had finally told me part of the truth. He wasn't calling to reopen the past or damage our marriage. He simply believed I deserved to know everything, because he had spent too many years assuming I already did. For nearly an hour, I listened while he filled in gaps Brooke had never mentioned. Some details matched her confession. Others didn't. According to him, their relationship continued longer than she admitted, and their final goodbye happened much closer to our engagement than I had been told. He wasn't angry, proud, or defensive. If anything, he sounded tired of carrying a story that no longer belonged to him. When I hung up, I realized I had learned more in one conversation with a man I hadn't spoken to in 25 years than from every discussion Brooke and I had shared since her confession. That realization hurt more than anything Tyler actually said. At the same time, our children began noticing the distance between us. They were adults with families of their own, but they knew our routines too well to miss the changes. Brooke and I still worked side by side, still ate dinner together, still smiled when they visited. Yet every conversation felt carefully measured, as though we were both performing a version of our marriage that neither of us completely recognized anymore. A few days later, Brooke and I sat across from each other at our kitchen table after closing the workshop. The familiar sounds of the house filled the silence between us. The refrigerator hummed, the clock above the stove ticked steadily, and neither of us seemed willing to speak first. When Brooke finally did, her voice was calm, almost resigned. She said she had been a completely different person back then, immature, frightened, and incapable of making honest decisions. She told me she had spent the last 25 years trying to become the wife I deserved instead of the confused young woman she had once been. She reached across the table but stopped before touching my hand. "I know I can't change what happened," she said quietly. "Please don't let one terrible chapter erase everything we've built together." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. There was no anger left in my voice, only exhaustion. "The affair isn't the biggest problem anymore." She frowned, waiting for me to continue. "The biggest problem is that I made the most important decisions of my life without knowing the truth. I chose where we'd live, asked you to marry me, started a business with you, and raised a family believing a story that wasn't real." She lowered her eyes, and for the first time since her confession, she didn't try to explain or defend herself. We sat there in silence, separated less by the width of the kitchen table than by 25 years of missing truth that neither of us could put back where it had once belonged. Nothing dramatic happened after that conversation. We still unlocked the workshop together every morning, answered customers with the same practiced smiles, and spent weekends with our children whenever they invited us over. From the outside, our lives looked unchanged. Inside the house, though, a quiet distance settled between us. It wasn't anger anymore. It was the absence of certainty, and neither of us knew how to cross it. Brooke stopped waiting for me to ask questions. Instead, she began bringing me things on her own. One evening, she placed a small bundle of old letters beside my coffee without saying a word. A few days later, she found photographs from college, receipts from forgotten trips, and greeting cards she thought might matter. She said she wanted every remaining secret out in the open, even if it embarrassed her. I thanked her, looked through each item carefully, and put everything back into the same box. I no longer felt the need to investigate. If another truth appeared, it appeared. If it didn't, I wasn't going to chase it. The past had already changed more than I believed possible, and forcing more answers wouldn't restore the version of my life I had lost. Slowly, the situation began unfolding without my help. Brooke talked more freely than she ever had before, sometimes correcting herself before I noticed a contradiction. I listened without interrupting. The less I tried to control the conversation, the more honestly it seemed to move on its own, carrying both of us toward a future neither of us could yet describe. I still don't know how our marriage will end. People expect stories like ours to finish with slammed doors, courtrooms, or dramatic goodbyes. Real life has been quieter than that. Every morning, Brooke and I still wake beneath the same roof, drink coffee from the same mugs, and drive to the workshop together. We still laugh occasionally, mostly out of habit, and sometimes we even forget, for a few minutes, that everything changed on the porch that afternoon. The affair itself is no longer the part that keeps me awake at night. Those choices belong to two young people who barely understood themselves. What stays with me is something far heavier. I built 25 years of decisions on a version of the truth that never existed. I cannot return to the man I was before Brooke whispered those 5 words because that man believed in a beginning that wasn't real. I don't hate her. I don't spend my days looking for someone to blame, and I no longer feel any need to prove that my pain is greater than her regret. None of that would restore what was lost. What I can do is accept that our story was always more complicated than I knew. Whether we remain husband and wife or eventually become two people who once shared a remarkable life, I finally see our history without the comforting edits that carried us through so many years. That truth is painful, but at least it is whole again now. Our silver wedding anniversary is only a few weeks away. The invitations have already been mailed, the restaurant has been booked for months, and our children keep talking about the speeches they'll give that evening. To everyone else, it will look like a celebration of 25 successful years. Only Brooke and I know that the foundation beneath that celebration has shifted. Sometimes I catch her watching me, as though she's trying to guess what decision I'll eventually make. The truth is, I don't know yet. I no longer feel pressured to choose quickly. Some truths deserve time simply because they arrived so late. What I do know is this: The greatest shock wasn't discovering that Brooke had betrayed my trust when we were young. It was realizing that I had spent 25 years loving a story that had never been complete. When we walk into that anniversary dinner, people will believe they're celebrating the beginning of our marriage. I'll be wondering whether I'm celebrating our story, or the day I finally learned how it truly began.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.